going as a woman to the front line, cutting through the red tape and documenting the atrocities of the Nazi regime.
I learned a lot just reading the script and spending time with Kate.
How did it really feel to get into Hitler's bath? Even when I wanted to look away, I knew I couldn't. There are different kinds of wounds, not just the ones you can see.
I know this was a real passion project for you.
Yes.
And so I guess I wondered if you could just start by telling us how you first became familiar with the work of Lee Miller, and what was it originally that kind of sparked the idea to make this film about her life?
So I knew who Lee Miller was, and I was familiar with a lot of her photographic work, but I was also very aware of how almost not underrated but unexplored the most significant decade of her life truly was. She had always been viewed through the male gaze. She's written about as having been the former muse of Man Ray, ex-cover girl, former model, these kind of slightly patronising, almost infantilising labels that were slapped on her, and that was connected to a sliver of her life in her 20s. And actually she lived many, many versions of her life, Lee. She was an incredible woman, very powerful, really passionate and brilliant as a photographer. And so I bought a table at auction that had existed in a home where Lee and Roland Penrose spent a lot of their courtship, with many of the other surrealists experiencing these kind of hedonistic summers of love, and Man Ray was there, and Paul Eluard and Max Ernst and Lee and Roland, and they would have these meals around this huge table. And I bought this table, and it came to my house, and I sat there and I thought, Lee Miller, why has no one made a film about her? Cut to 9 years later, and I now know probably why no one's made a film about Lee Miller, because it was incredibly hard to really define that period of her life that we wanted to talk about, that mattered to me the most, and I think that celebrates the phenomenal work she did in going as a woman to the front line, cutting through the red tape and documenting the atrocities of the Nazi regime for the female readers of Vogue. And she just didn't believe in hiding the truth, and she would stop at nothing until she had found it.
I'm interested in the framing device of the film is obviously Lee Miller being interviewed, and that kind of made me think, if you had the chance to ask Lee Miller one question, what would you think that would have been if you could have asked her one thing?
Someone asked me this the other day, and I was a little bit lost for words, because there are so many things I think I'd want to ask her. I think I would probably ask her, how did it really feel to get into Hitler's bath? Because there's a very famous image of her that was taken by her friend, Davy Sherman, who was a photographer for Life magazine at the time, and the two of them were kind of joined at the hip during the war, and they bribed their way into Hitler's apartment. Hitler had vanished at that point. He'd escaped to his bunker in Berlin. It was on the day of the liberation of Dachau, and Lee and Davy had been present in Dachau that morning. They were among the first people there, and they went to Munich, and she knew where his apartment was. She got her way in there. There was another regiment already in there pretty much having a party, and she realised that there was a bathroom, and she went in and she turned on the tap, realised there was hot water. They hadn't touched hot water for 6 weeks. They hadn't washed, they hadn't even changed their clothes. So of course she got in the bath. And then she of course realised, okay, that's a scoop. Davy, get in here, take a photograph of me. And Davy also was photographed in the bath too. And I just think I would ask her, how did that really feel? Like, what was going through your mind? Yeah. She was spectacularly brave.
Yes. I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. I don't know.
Yeah, I do.
Maybe, what's your favorite photograph you ever took?
Do you
That's
have
a great
your
answer?
What was?
I would ask her, what's the greatest photograph you ever took?
Oh.
Do you two
You
both
can edit out his answer and just give me that. Thank you.
Do you two
Just like on set.
Yeah.
Do you two have a favourite photograph of Lee Miller's that you found, either that you knew before or that you kind of discovered while making the film?
For me, I would say it's hard to say like a favorite because so many of them are so harrowing, but certainly found many of them very affecting, you know, sort of capturing the horrors of war. What about you?
I mean, I think obviously the iconic one of her that David Sherman took of her in the bathtub was, I'm embarrassed to say, but I didn't know that much about Lee Miller before getting involved with this project. I knew that she was, I'd seen that iconic photographed in some of the shots from Dachau, but I wasn't that familiar with her incredible life story, and so it was really, I learned a lot just reading the script and spending time with Kate, who'd been working on this for, I think it was like 8 years in development. So just to be immersed in that and spending time with her and Ellen was just so educational and interesting and fascinating. And it was kind of mind-boggling once I started to kind of dive into that world that this story hadn't been told before, because what an extraordinary human being and photographer she was, and how groundbreaking her work was. But yeah, but I didn't know much about her before this.
And you mentioned that 8 years that Kate had spent kind of developing this project, and it really was, it seems like a real passion project for her. How did that kind of come across to you on set? Was there any kind of particular moments where you could just see how passionate Kate Winslet was about this film?
I would say there were moments where she would talk about things from Lee's past as if we all knew them, because I think she was so immersed in it that she just assumed everyone was where she was at with the 8 years of accruing knowledge about her. And but it was nice because it put you in this state of mind of like, oh yeah, we better know it all, because we're going to be referencing it throughout. It was cool. It was cool. I mean, I think when you know the person you're working with and who's sort of driving the project cares that much about it, it gets you all the more engaged and passionate about it and in sort of step with them.
Yeah, and not only Lee Miller, she knew everyone Lee Miller ever met, basically, knew everything about all these characters. So that was just a kind of a wealth of knowledge, and to be able to spend time with Kate and her talking about Roland, my character, and the relationship between Lee and him. She spent a lot of time with Anthony Penrose, their son, and it was just in doing research. There was so much that she gave me that I wouldn't have been able to find anywhere else. Because again, 8 years of knowledge of the whole world, that whole era was incredibly valuable to me.
If you've begun to have a very deep relationship with a story that you're telling, which is absolutely what Kate had with Lee Miller, and really Lee's entire family in a sense, but a legacy, there need be no proof of passion. It's just evident. You know, by the time I came to this project, Kate was 7 years knee deep, and had spent a lot of time with very, very difficult images, and had really explored the nooks and crannies of how Lee was possibly unable to get over what she'd seen, and her self-medication, and through alcohol, and difficult relationships with her family, who loved her very dearly. She was so deep in that when you meet somebody at that moment, it is so inspiring, and I feel a kinship, and I wanted to get as deep as I could with Audrey, and that was actually very possible because Audrey Withers, the editor of British Vogue during the Second World War, was an interesting character. She was in a very conservative world. She was a staunch socialist. She was hugely interested in literature and wanted very much to be a writer. And one of the only platforms you were able to do that as a woman at the time was Vogue. Vogue was providing that platform for young women coming out of often Oxbridge. It was very imbalanced, in terms of Audrey was fortunate enough to have two academic parents, and so she was able to have a voice, and it was very different for a working class woman to even come near to having a voice, or a working class man at the time. But she really was able to give voice to Lee, because she saw in Lee an extraordinary journalist, an extraordinary photojournalist, an extraordinary writer who was able to convey the horrors of something so far away, not just with integrity, but with real beauty, Lee was an extraordinary writer, and so it was a great privilege to be able to play that part, and I found Audrey just fascinating.
Yeah, I was really interested in the, after all these images have been captured, there was, it was difficult to get them published, and there is that scene where, Lee is on, she flicks through the magazine and she doesn't see them there. Can you kind of understand why there was a reluctance? Why do you think that was, to kind of show the world these horrible, horrible atrocities and show the world these images?
Well, we know historically, so it was a decision made by the ministry here in Britain that would be the inappropriate thing to do when everybody was trying to recover from the war effort. And it was a decision that was taken out of Audrey's hands, and that she regretted, I think, until she regretted for the rest of her life. Yeah. She did manage to get them printed in American Vogue. But really that was a horrible, horrible fracturing moment for Audrey and Lee's relationship. And they ultimately came through it. She was heartbroken that couldn't happen. Yeah. And certainly the last thing that she wanted was then for Lee to destroy everything that she'd so really bravely lived through and immortalised on film.
Well, for us, this was always a film about a woman and her own internal war, and less a film about war. And we were very much led by the images that she took, and we tried to be as truthful to those images in our recreation of them, and our imagining of the scenarios around the circumstances that led her to those images that she captured. We just wanted to treat everything with as much compassion and respect as she clearly did. And we do know that she was a phenomenally kind individual, and part of her skill was working with that Rolleiflex camera that I had to get extremely good at using, had to practically do it with my eyes closed. But the thing that's interesting about the Rolleiflex camera is that it doesn't sit in front of the eye, so you don't hold it up and say, hey, look over here, and then the subject would feel as though they are posing and therefore become self-conscious. The Rolleiflex hangs around the neck and it actually sits almost just slightly lower than the heart, in front of the stomach, actually. And so what that did for Lee was it gave her the opportunity to form connections with people. She could really talk to people and say, hey, tell me your story. And so she would get very, very raw, candid images. She was really one of the early reportage photographers, I guess. And we just tried to stay as truthful to her exact images as we possibly could, and very much lent on those images to propel us through our narrative.